Okay, so let's talk about something fun for a minute. The whole reason that I talk about consciousness, ladies and gentlemen. Let me turn on the lights first. Okay. This is my favorite subject because guess what? In the last 2,000 plus years, everyone has been living with PTSD. When I talk to you guys about dealing with your unconscious, this is at the heart of it. Because this is created so many times over from being alive. Because situations happen to us, what we call trauma or, trauma basically, attacking, violence, all sorts of things come to us and create this. Now, my nice little diagram here is going to show you kind of how I see PTSD. Or sort of how basically how I see PTSD. So, here's, we'll just say this is a normal person, right? Normal consciousness. This is a consciousness with PTSD. Now, there's going to be the unconscious side, which I'll get into later, but if you are living in the present experience and you have PTSD, because you are a soldier, because there was a trauma because of something, this is a consciousness where the soul and the consciousness still have a chance to connect. This is one where the soul and the consciousness have disconnected. As Carl Jung says, it's a neuroses. So, because what I figured out with doing Reiki and working with PTSD, well, not really working with PTSD, but when I was about 19, I slept outside, which caused a fracture in my head. Oops. This fracture basically was that moment. It was a PTSD moment. I didn't really realize this until after I started doing a lot of Reiki to myself. And when I started doing a lot of Reiki to myself, I came up with, actually I was a little bit older, 19, but anyways, because I ended up homeless for an evening, which, at 20 years of age or whatever, was quite traumatic. It was, something that freaked me right the fuck out. Because I was raised by lawyers. So I came from a somewhat affluent background, well, an educated background, we won't say affluent, because I wasn't ever rich. I never was a part of wealth. So but I was always led to believe that, one of the more important things that we needed to focus on was this. So this was what my entire age range from, 5 to, 18. This is what I was always focused about. I had to earn money, I had to do this, I had to do that, blah, blah, blah. So when at 20, we'll say between 18 and 20, I end up homeless, well, it counteracted everything that I was ever taught. Because it showed me that this wasn't going to save me, this wasn't going to be there for me. So that was the end of, that was what happened to me, and the subsequent reaction to that moment was a lot of behavior patterns around not ever being home, not ever being, like when I was with what are they called? When I had roommates and stuff, I always ran out of the house. I always made things different because of that exact moment. Now, what I want to talk about more is the demographic of this. Because this, ladies and gentlemen, is my favorite science. Why? Because the unconscious is the one thing that nobody talks about. Because why? Everybody's focused on the external. The external is all a reflection of the inner. So we continue to focus on the external. Keywords, ascension, keywords, twin flames, keywords, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is, our internal world has been affected by DNA. Science has said that we are only going to be as happy as our genetic coding tells us we are. Our science tells us that trauma is now encoded on DNA. So, what does that tell you? Well, this, the unconscious, which is part of the DNA, has a lot more power than we know. I found a quote in some of my files on my computer that said that the unconscious was 30,000 times more powerful than the conscious. 30,000 more times than your consciousness. So, let's talk about how we arrive at this conclusion that PTSD has been ongoing far beyond recent years. Because recent years, we actually have a name for PTSD, right? PTSD, we have a name. But what happens in man's history? Man's history has been about one thing: war. Where do we suspect PTSD comes from for the most part? War. So if we've always been at war, then that means that we've always been breeding and when we breed, as science has now admitted, we breed this into our DNA. So for the entire history of humanity, we've been breeding trauma into our DNA. What I found interesting is, and I haven't really followed up on it though, is the amount of autism, Down syndrome, etc. that's been coming up in our genetics. I could relate it probably back to this, but I'm not going to worry about it because I personally like autistic and Down syndrome people because they're quite fascinating, and I also hold one of the spiritual values that they're more advanced than we are because their brains are far more intelligent than ours. Just like dolphins and animals that, but we're all human, and humans are, simple and dumb. Simple and dumb, that's pretty much what we are. So let's talk about PTSD. So let's not even go back that far. Let's talk about World War I. So now you have Germans, Brits, some Americans, Russians, right? All coming home with PTSD. Because this is the first major war that affected a large percentage of the population. Well, that sense of the population grew because now we had this one. Now this one's even more of a key point to me because of one thing. I watched there's a picture or meme or whatever is going around Facebook every so often, and there was something like 948 Holocaust camp survivors with their family after several generations. That number ended up being 1 million people after we'll just say 1950. So from 1950 to 2015, 1 million people were bred from this 948. So this 948 are all Holocaust survivors. So what they endured is trauma. Now what makes this even worse is there was no psychiatry. There was nothing to help them through this. Now we can talk about how there's the Holocaust Museum, there's other ways that people have dealt with the trauma of World War II. But the point is that this trauma has now been bred into 1 million people. So, and that's just one set of people. That's just one set of Holocaust survivors. So those people are in, Germany, they're in Poland, they're in wherever these survivors settled and built their families. So then we have some more problems. Because after World War II, we had Vietnam, Korea, now we've had Iraq, Afghanistan, and on and on and on and on and on. And there's been one problem this entire time. Denial. To this day, the government denies what has happened. The government has been denying PTSD. So, what happens when a man has emotion? A man is supposed to do this to his emotion. Because that's what masculinity has looked like for, decades. Actually, it was because of World War II a lot of this shit happened. Because if you go back to what humanity was doing before World War II, specifically the 30s, humanity was a lot more open, and that's what a lot of people in today's day and age don't realize, is that before World War II and Hitler's destruction of Europe, there was a lot more sexuality happening, there was a lot more homosexuality happening, there was a lot more freedom happening, but two different things happened during the 1930s that led to a large percentage of where we are with all our problems. The first one was this. We all know that. Okay? That was the first one. The second one was the opposite. The Catholic Church. Now, no, Jason, no. The Christians have been great. Everything's been fine. No, these aren't bad people. But see, these guys started controlling this. Hollywood. The Catholic Church, when you watch documentaries, actually told Hollywood what they could and could not publish, what they could and could not film, what they could and could not do. The Catholic Church, for many, many years, controlled what we saw as a public species. So they basically controlled the media. So now, we have the damage of World War II, and now we have the control of religion during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Until, things started changing when we started filming more risque things. And this, my friends, has all been bred into every one of us. I'm not free of it. You're not free of it. It's in both of us. It's in all of us. It's everywhere. So, okay, now, twin flames. Depending on whether or not we suffer from this in a different way, because whether or not we've had trauma, violence, basically lack of closure. As twin flames who have the runner situation, guess what you're doing? You, ladies and gentlemen, as twin flames, this is the runner. Okay? The runner, both parties suffer from PTSD. Both parties, more to the point than that, both parties suffer from trauma. So it's no wonder the relationship doesn't work out. It's no wonder that people don't want to talk about shit. It's no wonder that we don't want to deal with stuff. Because guess what? The trauma is there. And the trauma keeps us... My towel doesn't really work today. Alright. I'm going to have to wipe this down. The trauma keeps us separated. Because we experienced some sort of trauma and now our relationships are suffering. But let's take it out as twin flames. Let's just make it 2016. What are our relationships doing? Well, it's still doing this. Because why? Because PTSD has been bred into our genes, created our thinking. Because every single person who's been to war, which, you know, when you're in the American public, guess what? Guess who most of your politicians are? Most of your politicians have served in the war. John McCain was in the war. There's all these generals that were in the war that became politicians. So you have this constant pushing of PTSD into the public. Part of that is religion. Which is why the US system is right now falling apart. Because people have never dealt with their PTSD. They've never dealt with their traumas. They don't even sometimes know that they had a trauma. Case in point, me sleeping outside for a night. I didn't know that was a trauma until I was doing Reiki. And once I was doing Reiki and I connected to that energy, and that energy sort of sent a huge shock through my body, that's when I realized that I had experienced and suffered a moment of PTSD many, many years ago. Now I say clinically PTSD only because PTSD makes sense to what it was. But simply put, PTSD is also this. And where do all our traumas get stored? Okay. One of the ladies that responded to me and told me about her and her partner, well, they had, you know, from what she described, is kind of volatile, etc., etc. Well, that whole experience is now here. Every one of you who's had a runner situation, you're now dealing with trauma being buried into your unconscious. So, this, my friends, is why I tell you to get into your unconscious so you can undo this. You can get away from it. I just had someone on Facebook call people in the Arab lands pig fuckers. Now, this person was actually referring to, you know, that terrorist organization that everybody's afraid of that never does anything except for, you know, maybe in Europe. And he exhibited signs of this. Because by calling a group of people pig fuckers, which is nicely racially motivated, it's rooted in that. Where's that from? Here. But see, here's the weird thing about this. Here's the weird thing about trauma. Trauma can simply be embedded by this person. By your parents. Well, I guess we should do this. Because your parents were brought up in their own situation, and depending on how old you are, it depends on how you know, much your parents are dealing with it from a direct level to an unconscious level. This person creates this, which creates that. Because the reason this person creates this is because this person imposes their beliefs. Once their beliefs are imposed and they are accepted and no longer fought against by said child, this develops. The trauma becomes anger, anger becomes a behavior, behavior becomes a way of living, and a way of living becomes a life. So all of this ends up creating life. Right? And that's the problem with what's going on in the world today. This is creating this because of this, from this, and the unconscious. If you want to get back into love, if you want to get back into joy, peace, serenity, all the rest of that, if you want to live a truly spiritual world and life, regardless of whether you have a twin flame, regardless of whether you're going to be rich and famous, regardless of anything, you must go back here. Because unless you're here, you won't understand anything that's going on in your life. You won't look at your behavior or your actions, because you won't be looking at what you're thinking. Whoops. Thinking. Which is what creates all of this, which is what creates all of that, because why? We want to be loved. And if our parents have taught us that love is based in anger, that love is based in violence, that love is based in fear, guess what we do? We recreate that over and over and over and over, because this is creating reality. Now, before I wrap this up, I'm going to talk about something really, really fast that has to do with the unconscious, that has to do with how thinking happens. And we're going to talk about it. So, give me 1 second here, kids. We're going to talk about myth, archetypes. Okay? Myth. Archetypes. Okay, so we're going to talk about this. Whoops, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Judaism, Christianity, Islam. These three religions all have one thing, well, they have two things in common. The first thing they have in common is that they are all Abraham. They're all Abraham's children. So there you go. You have Abraham created all of these religions. All of these religions come from this one person. Now, I can debate whether Abraham was real or not. Doesn't matter to me, because it's all fake. It's all mythology. You know why? Because if this wasn't mythology, then the Buddhism wouldn't have happened. The Hinduism wouldn't have happened. Different religions, different beliefs, different things wouldn't have happened outside of this if this was absolute. It's not. But because that happened, all of these, which now control the majority of the population of the earth, are all waiting for this. They're all waiting for a Messiah. Now, what does this Messiah represent to these people? It represents salvation. So here's the problem. 5 billion people are all waiting for technically one person, okay? Because each religion claims one Messiah. Judaism doesn't recognize Christianity. Islam recognizes Christianity but does not recognize Judaism. And all three of them are waiting for their Messiah. So, really what that says is someone else. Okay? That's what they're waiting for. The belief system that someone else is coming means that they don't have to do anything. They have to follow the tenets to some degree, but that because they belong to 1, 2, or 3, when this Messiah comes, they will be saved. In other words, Harry Potter's coming back with a magic wand and he's going to make everything okay. So, again, going back to the unconscious, again, going back to, past World War II and the trauma, we're going to, what are we believing? What are we taught? What are we believing in our unconscious? Someone else greater than us will clean up our mess. Because all 3 of those myths talk about the Savior making the world a better place again. You ever know with Christianity, there's Judgment Day, with Judaism and Islam, I'm not really as familiar with it, but this is our biggest problem. Someone else is going to come up and clean the mess. This is what's going on in the Western world. This is why we have such bad pollution problems. This is why we basically run amok like a bunch of spoiled little shithead children and destroyed the planet. Because we all unconsciously believe, whether we want to or not, that someone else is coming back. Namely, that person would be Jesus. So, we believe that Jesus is coming back. So we believe that some magical figure is going to come back from, out of thin air and save us. So, we have a problem right now. Here we go back to my favorite thing now. Here is religion. Here is, well, we'll say, lack. So we have 2 problems going on. First one is that this is dying. The need to rely on an external source is dying. It's taking a while, don't get me wrong, but it's dying. And so we need to look at the fact that this is now dying. This is a large part of what's going on in the world. Because with this dying, with the death of religion, well, there's now a void. This is where the new atheists are coming in and being as extreme as some of the most fundamental religious people. But there's a lack in there, because now we have this problem. Well, if there's no religion, well, what do? How do we fill up this void that's been inside of us by religion? Well, that's up to every single human being to find their own way, find their own purpose, do their own thing. But because of this, we now have a vacuum starting. And with the vacuum starting, we still have one problem. Whoops, hold on. We still have one problem, is that in the vacuum, the unconscious still believes 2,000 plus years of an archetype. 2,000 plus years of, someone else is going to fix it, someone else is going to fix it, someone else is going to fix it. So here, in our lack of consciousness, because we no longer believe as strongly in religion, and our unconscious is still fighting us with this belief system, we now buy things like televisions and cars and, this is our ecological, jump, the 1800s where we, manifested, cars, automobiles, that whole jump. Well, our unconscious hasn't caught up to this. Our consciousness right now is lacking all of this, but our unconscious hasn't quite got there. So we're still in a big void because religion is dying, and we're now trying to figure out what's next. What are we going to replace it with? But that still leaves us with an unconscious that's creating a world based on a religious dynamic that's dying. Take this from the macro to the micro. In other words, take it from my big example of worldwide issues of mass consciousness, bring it back to your consciousness. You're lacking in awareness because you don't see what's really going on. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to ask you guys to let me know what you think and talk to me about this, because I need feedback. I need to know if you guys are getting what I'm saying, if it's making any sense. And this is a 31-minute video, and I'm really sorry for the length of time, but there it is.